and welcome to Season 4, Episode 14 of Inside the Rookery. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Today we're talking about Edition Wars. Are you a big fan of a classic game and have opinions when it is re-released? I'm sure my panelists do today. I'm your host, Lindsay Law, and I'm joined today by Andy Law, James Wallis, and Andy Leask, and of course, everyone in the chat. As always, we have had lots of pre-submitted questions, but please get involved and add your comments and questions as we go through in the chat. We shall get started. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Shall we start with the very simplest question from Kilishandra? Why do a new edition of anything?
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's
Dollar bills.
that is a reason. It's not just the money. It's also you can rekindle support for a game with a new edition. You can bring back people who had left the fold because they've been attracted away to something new and shiny. You can get the attention of distributors and retailers, which used to be, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that was the market. You had to, if those people were not on side, you did not have a market for your game. Less important these days, but still absolutely a factor, particularly for the larger systems that still rely an awful lot on game shop sales and bookshop sales and stuff like that. And you can try and bring in a new market as well. There's an interesting thing, and I think this is going to lead us elsewhere, on a completely different discussion that was happening on Twitter earlier today. Somebody talking about the Roald Dahl stuff. Are you familiar with the what's it called, the Heinz
maneuver?
The Heinz maneuver.
Yeah.
Yes. So to précis the Heinz maneuver, this is when a company whose sales on a product perhaps are flagging put out a big flashy press release going to completely revise this and take away all the things that made you love it when you were a child. And there will be a backlash. You might even get some national press attention. And then you put out another press attention release going, we're going to leave it exactly the way it was. We have responded to public attention. You look good. You've had a massive publicity for your product. Sales boom. Now, the same thing happens. A chap called John Bull, not the kind of poster you'd think would use that name on Twitter, was talking about this. And also talked specifically because he knows Ian Livingstone. I was talking about the reaction Ian Livingstone got when Scholastic changed the artwork in the Fighting Fantasy books for a revised edition. And all the grognards and the old schoolers went, how dare you mess with my childhood? And Ian's response quite reasonably was, well, when was the last time you bought a Fighting Fantasy book? These aren't for you anymore. These are for the market that we had back in the 80s, which was boys who don't want to read, but will read these. Fighting Fantasy, once they realized it was a success, they worked out that its primary use was really as a route into reading and literacy for a lot of kids who had been put off that and wanted to do it. So that was why Scholastic revised all the artwork to make it appealing for kids who would be put off by 1980s style artwork, but put 2010s, 2020s artwork on there. Fantastic. And it worked, and Fighting Fantasy is still out there. So revitalizing your market, creating a new market, yes, it does come down to the money in the long run. But then there's also the thing, because role-playing games, and I'm aware I'm monopolizing the discussion completely. I have opinions. If it's a lot of role-playing publishing is at the hobby level. It's people who love a particular game. They're into it for a particular game. They may be making money elsewhere on the side. They're doing the game because they love the game and they want to support it, but they feel that the game could do with improvement, could do with an update. And yes, so some additions are done to improve the game in the views of those creators. And inevitably, you will run up against people who go, how dare you, it was perfect as it was, or how dare you take it this way when it should have gone that way. Because everyone has their own opinions, and that's absolutely fine. That's the nature of the beast. But really,
that makes me think of She-Ra, the recent reboot of She-Ra, and I saw a lot of tears on Twitter about that. But actually, the people that I knew who were watching it, like my kids, their friends,
it was freaking awesome.
All of their hearts. I mean, I actually
my kids were completely into it.
completely into it. Yeah, and yeah, it wasn't the same. Well, who would want to remake that She-Ra anyway? Well, apparently, a load of men on Twitter wanted that She-Ra to be remade.
Bunch of
Yeah.
middle-aged men who were never the primary target
We were
anyway.
never the primary
Absolutely.
target. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's like the people who are massively overinvested in My Little Pony. It's not for you. You are not the primary market. Shut up.
Yeah. Although, in saying that, I do quite like a My Little Pony, and if you want to buy it, then crack on, but don't whine about it because you're not the primary market.
Yes.
Like, accept it for what it is now. Yeah.
So James has been quite comprehensive in his answer. So I'm going to not say many of the things I was going to say because James has covered a good chunk of that. But I will add one
Sorry.
extra that he no, it's good that he alluded to, and it's particularly prevalent in the role-playing market and to a degree the board games market, much less so. And that's just for love, because you love that particular system, you love a particular game, you managed to grab hold of that license, or you were a holder of that license some time ago, or perhaps you created it in a previous generation and you've managed to reclaim it from whomever has owned it in the interim. And as a labor of love, you bring it back to the market. That's something that's relatively common in the RPG circles. There's a game that you love, you decide you publish it, you make nowhere near as much money as you hoped, or if you're very lucky, you chaosium it and you do very well indeed. And I think that's an extra on top of everything that James said, because it's very much something that does happen in our field.
Yeah.
And I think as well that there are always constraints, aren't there, when you're making a product of deadlines or time or money. So I think, that whole statement about how a work of art's never finished, it's just abandoned. I think there are very few creators who would release something and think it is actually finished now. It is they're never like, oh no, but if I could just, but the print deadline's come, so it's got to go. So you're always got that little niggling a dissatisfaction. All you can see is the thing that you would have done if you'd had 2 more weeks. So
I know that one well.
Yeah.
Here's a comment from Darker Days Radio. This is the issue with Vampire. It had Requiem, which was a remix, which the Grogs were up in arms about, but it outsold the old editions. Then V20 was out, and the Grogs were angry that it was just all the old content with minor tweaks, and they had that already. And then V5 comes out, and that is not enough of a change, too much of a change. Yeah. I feel you.
Edition Wars.
I always feel if you've got an equal number of people complaining that it's too different or it's not different enough, you've probably got it right.
Yeah.
You're never going to make them all happy, but if they are equally outraged on either side, you've hit the balance.
The BBC situation.
And there is.
Don't get me started on that.
I'm going to be perhaps a little bit controversial, or at least a little annoying here, by saying in an awful lot of undercurrents of these conversations about you've done it all wrong, the undercurrent is, why didn't you get me to do it? In a lot of the fan conversations, why wasn't I consulted? And it's very difficult to defuse that, even if you're doing questionnaires and everything about what do you want to see in a new edition. The way D&D have approached their new edition is really interesting, because they're doing what they can, quite apart from torpedoing it with the OGL, but that's an entirely different discussion. But they are really consulting people. They're really talking to a lot of people. And part of that is making people want to feel involved and invested in the new system. Because having a game having players is important, but what's crucial to the survival, particularly of a lower level game, is having evangelists, people who are so invested in the game that they will go out and create new players for it, and will build, will publicize it through their actions. And if you can build that, if you're publishing a game and you've got evangelists on your side, and this is what happened with Munchausen very quickly in 1998, Ken Hite basically became its St. Paul and went out and spread the gospel of Munchausen. He only did it for a couple of months, but that was enough to create a groundswell of people going, all right, I'll spend what was $6 on a role-playing game.
$6 whole dollars.
$6 whole dollars, yeah. It started off at 5, and Dan Steele of Esdevium Games convinced me to increase the price, because he said nobody, particularly at the distribution and retail level, would take it seriously at $5. $6, it's just psychologically slightly different.
That $1 makes difference. Yeah. What I was going to say is, it's funny you say that, James, because my experience of where I encountered Munchausen was exactly people evangelizing at cons. It was at a point when I was working for various games companies, and like every convention I went to, there were just people just wholeheartedly just go, oh my God, like it was absolutely a word of mouth thing. So yeah. I was enormously lucky that it got into the hands of the right people. It happens sometimes with games that you might not consider to be good games. If they just get into the hands of the right people who like them,
the word of mouth will spread.
Yep.
And that can be the difference between a hit game and a miss game.
Okay, so Seago asks, have you played an edition and then been frustrated as the new edition completely changes the way the game works?
Well, I mean, if people are playing their Rookery bingo at home, it's time for me to mention Conspiracy X. But I think that's a classic example of that. The difference between first edition and the second edition, which went Unisystem, it was entirely different. It lost all of the charm, all of the clever mechanics. It did gain the benefit that it could be more modular because you could link it with other games that used the Unisystem. But the Unisystem was, just bland. And that first edition Connex was really interesting, had really interesting mechanics, and it killed any enjoyment in the game. I have since that came out, I've not met anybody who actually wanted to play it, and it just died. Yeah.
So I'm not going to say the obvious Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3 because everybody's going to expect that. So instead, I'm going to go for a board game, and I'm going to go for Horus Heresy of all games. Horus Heresy was a marvelous in its first edition, old war game like Squad Leader from Avalon Hill. Produced by Games Workshop to reproduce, obviously, the Great Horus Heresy with the Emperor being attacked by Horus on Earth. And I loved it. I played that game every week for a good 2 or 3 years. And it had an infinite variability of possibilities in the way that it played. And I just adored the game. And then a new edition was brought out by FFG much later, a big box set with miniatures showing all manner of funky things. And it wasn't just a different game. It was an entirely different game and so much less characterful to boot. Now, I couldn't appreciate it for the game design decisions that it made because I was so disappointed by the game design decisions that it ditched. And I found it an exceedingly hard game to enjoy. And for someone who was very much a fan of the setting and the material, that's never a good starting point. So there's my big, I was very frustrated with the new edition, found it tough.
I just have to bring this comment on screen for James because that's actually hilarious. If you ever do a new Munchausen's edition, surely Munchausen's 2 by proxy is a no-brainer. That's actually brilliant.
That's very good. Munchausen is on the 3rd edition right now, but and there's a Munchausen's by Doxy joke in the game, which is not a great joke, but kind of works. But yes, if I ever do a kind of bunch of fan tributes, it'll be Munchausen's by proxy, definitely.
Nice.
But yeah, I mean, I have 2 examples. One a board game, one a role-playing game. One is Sid Sackson's Acquire, which is one of the great board games. Came out in 1963, 1964 from 3M, the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company. Yes, the people who do Post-it notes. In the 60s, they launched a board games line for no reason that anyone can adequately explain. And they basically changed the face of board games forever because these were the predecessors for what became Euro games. They are aimed at adults, they are brilliantly presented, and they are, for the most part, really interesting designs. They did a version of Backgammon, they did a version of Wari, they did a version of Go. But Acquire is Sid Sackson's masterpiece. It is the game Monopoly wants to be when it grows up because it's a game about building and taking over hotel chains, and it's abstract and economic and tactical and absolutely brilliant. And there have been many, many editions since, and only one of them has ever been as good as the original. In particular, the rights are now with 3M sold its games division in the early 70s to Avalon Hill, who just republished the same thing as was. Avalon Hill is now, of course, part of Hasbro, and I think falls under Wizards of the Coast. And they've put out several editions, and they're cheap, and they're nasty, and they don't feel like the kind of deluxe experience that you were getting in the 1960s. It does not feel like this grown-up game. And they've not really changed the rules. The rules are very similar, but they've tweaked it. And there's one edition that just uses nasty bits of cardboard instead of plastic. It just... I talk about components and the physical feel of games, and this is just what they've done to Acquire is such a shame. The latest edition is not awful, but I would say if you want a copy of Acquire, go on eBay, buy the original. It's a masterpiece. It remains a masterpiece, and it bloody well ought to become very collectible very soon. The other one, And if you know me, I am entirely predictably going to talk about Ghostbusters now.
Yay, Ghostbusters!
The Ghostbusters role-playing game, which I maintain is one of the finest role-playing games ever published. Brief background for those who haven't heard me rant about Ghostbusters 4. Yes, it's a tie-in with the movie. It came out about a year or a couple of years after the movie did. It's designed by the Chaosium crew and published by West End, which means it was edited by Greg Costikyan, coming off the back of Paranoia. And it's just it captures the feel of the movie brilliantly. It's a very fast, very slick system, one of the first dice pool systems, one of the first hero point or action point systems. It uses physical cards to represent equipment. And it's funny. It's a humor game that's genuinely funny, not just to read, but actually to play. Just masterpiece, absolute masterpiece. West End went through, I don't know, I won't try to dredge up the details of what happened with the management. But anyway, a few years later, they did a new edition, Ghostbusters International, and they gave the game the one thing it did not need, which was more rules. Because it was the original is fast and intuitive, and all the rules, literally the first thing you get is it says read this first, and it's the entire rules of the game in 4 pages. And it's all you need to start running the sample adventure. And creating a true pick up and play role-playing game, a role-playing game that you can learn and start playing as quickly as you can learn and play a board game, has been one of my holy grails for a long, long time. And Ghostbusters, the original, does it brilliantly. And Ghostbusters International went, and here's more rules and more complexity and more stodge that is going to bog down your beautiful, light, improvisational humor game, where you can be Bill Murray, or you can be Dan Aykroyd, or you can be Ivan Reitman, or you can be Sigourney Weaver, or I think you can be Janice the receptionist, and I can't remember the actress's name, but yeah, because there's a limited number of characters in the Ghostbusters universe you actually want to be. I don't think you can be the accountant, but you get an awful lot of paperwork from him and contracts to sign. The box is stuffed with these things. The idea is you're running your own Ghostbusters franchise if you're creating your own characters. And there's an actual contract in the box for setting up a Ghostbusters franchise. And there's insurance code. It's brilliant. It is stupidly collectible, stupidly expensive, the original these days. If you do ever see one going cheap, just grab it.
So Rando doesn't like doesn't like the later editions of Talisman. The first edition played terribly. Andy Law will have opinions on that.
Oh, I have many opinions in Talisman.
Darker Days Radio. I love Iron Kingdom's second edition, which uses wargame rules, but new edition is D&D 5th edition. I think Wizards of the Coast needs to be careful with using feedback. Most of emergent problems in D&D 3rd edition came from giving everyone what the polls said they want without making sure all those pieces fit together. And Will Spain says Shadowrun 6th edition for me. And Balderstone has their parents' old copies of Acquire and Diplomacy. I can't imagine playing them with any other edition.
As a small comment on paying attention to user feedback, that can backfire if you say you will and then kind of don't. And that was what was the start of the edition wars between 1st edition and 2nd edition. In that there was a large pool of playtesters that played through the 2nd edition rule set before it was released. And they had many opinions. They were all old fans of the 1st edition. They saw what the new edition was doing. They spotted lots of what they considered to be errors. And then they posted them in. And none of them were addressed because it was very much going for a different style of game to what many people were expecting the 2nd edition to be. And that turned into the Liber Fanatica, a whole bunch of extra rules that were produced by fans. And to say that there was a disgruntled crowd at the release of 2nd edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is a massive underestimation for just how horrific the Black Industries, as it was at the time, that was the imprint of Black Library that dealt with the role-playing game. The Black Industries forum were an absolute nightmare. Every day there was people coming in, attacking each other wholesale, falling into insults about just how poorly the 2nd edition represented everything that the 1st edition had so clearly done with a great amount of ease. And it was an interesting time.
Yeah.
And
it was I'm having almost PTSD here, Andy.
Yeah.
Because we were both moderators in the forum, and
we were at the time.
It was It was intense.
Yeah, it was an intense period, and it lasted for almost 2 years. And it's particularly interesting to see, looking back, just how well regarded second edition is now by a large chunk of the crowd, and many of the people, because I remember them, who were its greatest detractors, who were standing on mounts with books, shaking them, explaining just how terrible they were as they threw them down to the ground and exposed all of the horrors that the second edition brought. And yeah, it's fascinating to see how acceptance eventually came to be the state of affairs. Admittedly, the books changed over time and many of the issues that were raised were addressed, but you have to be super careful because if you start off with your new game and you have done a big, give us all the feedback, and there's an expectation that feedback will be directly listened to. If it's not, you suddenly start with, well, all publicity is good publicity.
And I'm going to be careful what I say here because I don't want to poke the litigious bear. But the thing about the D&D feedback, like I have read quite a lot of people on Twitter alleging that they haven't actually been listening to the feedback. They've been taking a lot of it in, like insiders saying that they've been taking it in and disregarding it. But I do not know the truth of that. For I
It's
could
like
care
it's like
less.
a political consultation, right? So like politicians love to, and civil servants love to be like, yeah, we've got this law, or we've got this thing, we're going to consult on it. But they've already decided what it is. They just want to be able to say that they've
We've had a
consulted.
consultation. Yeah.
I have
Yeah.
been involved with some playtests that were that. And
Yeah, I
it was
hate
a
those.
deeply disappointing situation. And I was behind an NDA. And I was just left there going, so I have received all of this stuff, and I'm not allowed to touch it.
I just think
That's-
it wastes everyone's time. It wastes everyone's time. It wastes your time as the people who are running the playtest, and obviously your time is paid for, so that's a waste of money commercially. And it wastes time of people who are not being paid and who are doing it for the love of that game or for gaming in general. And I just think you're better to be honest and say, like, we don't have time to playtest, or we're not going to consult because we think our vision is perfect, or however it is you want to phrase it. My artistic vision will not be compromised.
That's the thing. Like, I mean, I think it speaks to all media, to be honest, actually. But people just need to get better at just going, yeah, it's just not for me. Like, that's okay. Not everything is for everyone. Like, I'm like that. Like Studio Ghibli films, right? I know loads of people love them. They're just not for me. I'm not going to criticize anyone for liking them. They're just not my cup of tea. They're not for me. But you know, if we look at, say, what's happening in DC fandom just now, regarding James Gunn versus the old Zack Snyder thing, like the level of vitriol that's out there over superhero movies, like, come on, guys.
Yeah,
A lot of it is nostalgia. I mean, a lot of the driver of this, and the older we get and the longer people have been in the hobby, the more entrenched it becomes, because you are dealing, you know, you put out a new edition, you're saying I'm trampling on your memories. Same reason I've never seen The Phantom Menace. Nobody gets to piss on my childhood, least of all George Lucas. I have seen the other ones, my God. Brief sideline anecdote. I saw Attack of the Clones in the cinema and kind of went, and then a friend of mine went, no, I've got tickets for the IMAX and someone's dropped out. Do you want to come? And I was like, oh, right. And it bludgeoned me into liking it simply by being very big and very loud. And it kind of worked on that level. And then I saw the third Matrix film on IMAX thinking, well, maybe it'll have the same effect. And my God, it didn't. That's just bad on every level, however you see it.
Brando says nostalgia just isn't what it used to be. When I was at uni, I was doing the psychology of adolescence, and we looked at a series of like newspaper articles, but basically they went all the way back to Roman times, and it was always that just moral panic about the youth of today that had been repeated over thousands of years, and the same people who had been the teenagers becoming the people who were panicking about them.
Yes, and the flip side of that is always the new media will corrupt and deprave the youth, whether that's plays or printing or novels or the theatre. I said plays already, or cinema in particular. Cinema was going to completely, and then television and rock and roll and punk rock and role-playing games in the early 80s. And these days it's TikTok.
I had
this one. Oh, sorry.
Well, I was going to say that I had a protracted argument with a colleague of mine who is adamant that because of the use of technology, young people's attention spans has got worse. And I'm like, well, none of my experience backs that up. Have you got any evidence for that? I'm like, no, but it's just obvious. And I'm like, but where's your evidence for that? Oh yeah, but it's just like, and it's purely, it's exactly that.
Maybe it's because he's boring.
Maybe.
Yeah,
and you correctly assumed the gender there. I'm like, yes.
Yeah, so beta versions. Rangdo says one good recent development is the release of beta versions, like with FFG's Star Wars games. I just wondered if we could talk about, like, are beta versions good, or are beta versions a way to get your fans to do stuff for you for free that you should have done yourself? Discuss.
What?
Yes.
Why not both?
Yeah, they're a bit of both. And I'm aware of a couple of games that have been released and then claimed to be beta versions slightly after the release date. I will name no names. But the concept of finishing something off, releasing it, and then asking everybody what you think of it, and do you spot any errors in it? Can we get them sorted before print? Is not a bad idea. It's particularly for small press, in fact, a really good idea, because sometimes small press can't afford to have very good proofreaders or very good editors in place, and being able to throw that out to the crowdsourced side of things is a good thing, and we've benefited from that ourselves. It's a good thing. For larger companies where they're producing large slick products, then I have less time for it there. You expect them to produce and release high quality, and similarly, people who have a high quality name or brand and release it full of errors and then say it's a beta, or alternatively they just release it full of errors, it is a beta, and they just sort of hope that everyone will fix it and don't. That's pretty unacceptable in my eyes as well. But as a general idea, I'm not against it.
I think particularly, like you say, Andy, if it's not marketed or clearly labeled as such at the beginning, I think if it's done like Matt Forbeck with the Marvel one, like it was very clear that that's a beta one that you're buying, and it's cheaper and it's simpler. So you're like, that's good, that's clear, you know what you're getting with that. You can participate or not. But like you say, it's the dishonesty of releasing it and then being like, oh, everybody said it's rubbish. Whoopsie. Yeah, it was a beta. Yeah, we meant that all along. Like that's people know when you're doing it. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Martin Ironrook, the PDF pre-release for free proofreading.
Yeah.
But then again, see, Martin, you're partly to blame for that because you're an excellent proofreader and you always spot stuff in our PDF. So really, it's your fault.
Mark McGranahan, I tend not to read betas, but we just wait for the final version. I have a lot of proofreading in my day job. Yeah.
I can find them quite frustrating to engage with because every time I hit an error, it causes me to cringe. I just feel like, why did no one catch that? Because I can't help myself. That's how I immediately react. And I find it tough. So I prefer to get the print one later, or the PDF after print.
Let's talk about a wish list. Long Shadow asks, what one game do you think needs a new edition and why? What would you change or add to make it better?
Okay, I'm going to go with a really controversial one because I dissed it earlier and didn't mention it, and I expect everyone half expected me to do so, and that's Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3 was chock-a-block full of really clever ideas that didn't quite land. They just weren't necessarily fully baked because they were entirely new, particularly for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And whether that was their rather clever implementation of, I just wrote a blog about this actually, about their clever implementation of party sheets and effectively creating a party character as well as your own individual characters to show that it is a shared experience. This isn't just about you as individuals. You're not just making your character, you're working together as a group. And those party meters having little tickers to show that things are going wrong, to give that sort of 5 minutes to midnight feel that's constantly prevalent behind the scenes of everything that is Warhammer. The use of cards for a variety of things where they were useful or sometimes where they really weren't, and oh my god, there were so many cards. But that's why I feel like a new edition could have made a really, really good game. Not necessarily my favorite role-playing game or my favorite Warhammer game, but I think you would have got an astonishingly good game. To a degree, you could claim that the Star Wars games from FFG were a sequel to a degree. They used a similar rule set. They were bridging off of it, but it lost all of the things that made it Warhammer. So you never really got to see what was coming next from what was, I think, some pretty clever ideas. If it just had someone come along and new editionify it, I think we could have had a really interesting 3.5.
It also lost, I think, a lot of the. I also think it lost a lot of the elegance of the game design in the Star Wars one as well, in terms of the clarity of what the kind of boon dice did and stuff, and the inconsistency in the Star Wars, and the fact that, and again, I know they probably did that because there was such a backlash against all the card components. But when you turn that into, it's in a hardback book, but you've got to keep looking it up to see, well, what does this skill do if I roll that boon dice?
Yes.
Oh, it doesn't have something specific, so it's a generic one. Oh no, but this skill does have something specific, and it's just absolutely impractical. It again reeks of something that was never play tested.
Darker Days Radio says, "Oh, chaos in the old world." Well, why, Darker Days Radio? What would you change? Well, he provides an answer. I wouldn't change it. Just print it with the Skaven built in. That is a great game,
Nice.
Chaos in the Old World.
Yeah. Yeah, we've not played that in a long time.
That's Eric Lang, isn't it?
It is. It's Eric Lang.
Yeah, he's
and
a genius.
It's a fascinating game because it's so bitty. There's so many working pieces, and it's not an elegant game. If I'm blunt, it's not necessarily a clever game, but it does completely nail the whole feel of each of those Chaos Gods bringing the world to an end. It just nails it.
I think
really
it relies on a little bit your understanding, and you can get that understanding quickly of how the gods play. Like, I like to play Zinch, and I like to do all the tricksy stuff, just like I like to play the Loki maneuver in that other game we play. What's that called, Andy?
Also Eric Lang.
I love that game.
Yeah.
To me, that is the sequel to Chaos in the Old World. Yeah. I would say that that is Chaos in the Old World improved. But if you're playing with people who don't know Warhammer and don't know the game, and they're playing with people who do know Warhammer or do know the game, I just feel that the game's really imbalanced. And you kind of, to make it fun for you, you actually have to explain to them and be like, right, okay, so Zinch works like this and Khorne works best like this. And I'm not sure that a game is brilliantly designed if it can't play as a group. Like, you need to play that with specific people for it to be fun.
I guess it's a genre of board game. I guess the ones that have that narrative element built in, like I was about to point, it's not there. Star Wars Rebellion, like that. I think similarly, it's an incredible game. I absolutely love it. But it's an asymmetric game like that. If you've never watched Star Wars, and there are a handful of people out there who haven't, it will feel baffling. It will feel weird. It won't. Whereas if you have played Star Wars, you get it immediately. You understand. Oh, right, I'm the rebels. I'm hyped. Okay. Oh no, I'm the Empire. I'm all about trying to pin you down. Like, it's really clear if you know that. And I don't. I guess. Like, I take your point that it's less universal, but I don't necessarily think that's a problem. Again, I think in the wide world that it's not for everyone. Like, that's okay.
Yeah. I just think you have to choose who you play it with, and sometimes, so say you've got a Sunday gaming and you've got 2 games to play and you've got a new person, you have to play that game twice for them to enjoy it, because the first time round is them understanding how to be able to win. And some games are not like that. Some games anyone can sit down, but you just explain it to them.
You just let them play Khorne. Let the new guy always play Khorne, because it's just fight all the time. Anytime you can fight.
Yeah. So a Long Shadow Game says, a slightly related question. We have gnomes in Wifrip 4th edition, which is something that was brought back. What else would you like to bring back in a new edition? It doesn't have to be Wifrip, of course.
I wish I'd had time to think about that.
Oh, okay. Well, we can go
It's a
back
good
to
question.
the other one.
Yeah.
Wolfsbane says rifts with a producer who just says stop when the wacky ideas come in.
But isn't the whole point of rifts the wacky ideas?
Yeah,
isn't that what it's for?
Having worked with Palladium, having written a Rift supplement, or a sort of a Rift supplement, it started off as an After the Bomb supplement, and then Kevin realised that the After the Bomb sales were dropping off, so he went, let's stick some Rifts in there as well. Yeah, it's all about the wacky ideas. It's all about the glittery new stuff and the things that are bigger than the things that were in the last book. And it just keeps growing and growing, and that's the delight of Rifts, really.
It is, I agree.
Yeah, Executor says the best thing about multiple editions is your house rules can nick the best bits from each one. That's why Wifrip 3rd edition is like that little anomaly, because it's so different, and it's, you know, you can pick ideas from it though. But yeah. So we'll go back to this question. What would you like to bring back in a new edition of any game you can think of?
Well, I mean, obviously, like, again, not to be the broken record, going back to Connex, like I think a lot of the mechanics in there, I would like to see in more RPGs in general. But I appreciate that they're not for everyone. This is something when Andy and I are talking about game design, we quite regularly talk about, like, I have no problem with the fact that somebody who's much, much better at something might always win against somebody who's rubbish at a thing. I don't think that's a problem, but I get that would annoy some people. So I do. But for me, I actually like that as a mechanic. Like, if somebody is the world's best martial artist and they're fighting against me with no martial arts training, they are going to kick my ass 100% of the time. And I'm okay with that, unless there's some environmental factor limiting it. Like, I'm okay with that.
Like a gun.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, but I totally understand. Like, I do understand that there is a need for players to feel that they have agency, and if you don't do that, it becomes unempowering and disengaging and things like that. But
Rando says, I'd like to remove color magic from Wifrip and get back to the whimsy or formation flying wizards.
Well, you can have formation flying wizards now. They're just like a rainbow through the sky. It's beautiful. Just flying in different ways. I would actually not necessarily a specific mechanic, but the other Connex mechanic that I really like was the use of Xener cards for the psychic powers. You know, the gimmick being, if you were actually psychic, that made you better at playing psychic. But I like mechanics with flavorful whimsy like that. I think I'd like more RPGs to embrace the sense of fun, because it's a game at the end of the day, and I think a lot of them have become increasingly serious, like the big ones. So, think mechanics that are like, I mean, Andy, you do this a lot in our games. Whatever system we're playing, the inclusion of mini games that are very obviously fun little separate games, and I think I'd like more of that in everything, to be honest, just as a design philosophy. So.
I found they were often required though, because the games that you were playing were often so rigid and fixed and dull. So having something that allowed you to just play and enjoy yourself whilst being part of a larger campaign was a necessary component to ensure that campaign could survive.
And sometimes whimsy, though, it's like whimsy for the sake of whimsy. So some of the games that did the starting player condition, right? And it was funny when you first played a game that was like, you know, the last person that went to a farm. And then every single game was like, oh, well, this game's set in Portugal, so it's the last person who went to Portugal. This game's here, so it's the person that did this. And actually, like, how often do people go to Portugal? No offense to Portugal, but like, people go to different countries, so always ended up being like the same person that went first. And it was like,
my sister-in-law, every time we play Azul, it's always her.
It's always her, right? Because she's the one that goes to Portugal. So I think, I thought that was genius when it first started in games, and then I was just like, oh, seriously, like, pick a different. Like,
I still think, I mean, done well, it can be great, and it beats the alternative, which most companies are doing these days, which is choose among yourselves who will go first. It's like, no, fuck off. I mean, tell me. I'm reading the rules because I want to be told what to do. Do not tell me to make it up.
That work, because that's the kind of thing. Because I think that works when you're teaching a game. Sometimes you need to choose who's going to go first in order to make it make sense. But you would do that anyway, even if the rule wasn't that. So
one rule we had in Once Upon a Time, second edition, which it was the 80s. No, it wasn't. It was the 90s. We were young. We were foolish. Was the player with the longest beard goes first, which was a way of saying oldest player, but in a kind of thematically appropriate way.
I mean,
but at the same time,
oldest man.
Oldest man.
Oldest man. There was one occasion, and I'm not going to say who I was playing with because they're known in the industry of the female nature, and she sighed and went, "That would be me." So yes, but it only happened once, and we did think about it. It was there for a reason, but three blokes in there. What were we? I don't know, however old we were at that point. Not old enough, evidently.
So Rando likes how in the wrong One Ring you get a little heal boost if you take off your helmet in battle. I am no man. Go no man. She's the best gnome.
Yeah, the
Oxykeeter-
One Ring actually is packed full of good little
Yeah.
things like that. Actually, it's very.
Thanks,
and
Francesco.
Then, Mark says I'd buy a book of Rook's mini games for slotting in as needed. Noted. We'll get Andy Law right on that.
Yeah.
Casual initiative systems are one of my least favorite design fads. That's for those of us who grew up in Dundee. A casual initiative system sends a chill down your spine.
Casuals being Neds, being,
Yeah.
The
street
people you
thug
didn't want to
types.
encounter on a Friday night when you were underage drinking in a pub in Dundee.
Those
Yeah.
casuals.
Just to plug something else I'm doing, one of my other podcasts, Ludonarrative Dissidents with Greg Stolze and Ross Payton, we've literally just recorded an episode entirely about initiative systems and how they work and which ones work and which ones don't, and action point combat systems as well. And yeah, the trouble with initiative systems generally, to précis an hour and a half of discussion, is that you need to know who goes first, because that's really important. But the more mechanical you make it and the more simulationist, that takes away from the role play experience. So initiative systems are really, really hard. And it is something that gets revised a lot in second editions. I don't think, has D&D ever repeated the same initiative system from edition to edition? I think it's always slightly different, because it's very hard to get right. And there are always things that the new generation of designers think they can do better or think should be fixed in the new edition. And I've been guilty of this myself. When we rebooted Paranoia a few years ago, myself and Grant Howitt and Paul Dean, and the brief was, Mongoose came to us and said, we want a new edition of Paranoia and we want cards in it. And I went, well, if you're putting cards in, that's a fairly fundamental change to the mechanics. Can we reboot it rather than simply calling it a new edition? And they went, yeah, all right, yes. And so we redesigned chunks of the background. In particular, one of the things we altered, because traditionally in Paranoia, and I'm assuming that everyone knows the background of Paranoia, but you're stuck in an underground bunker the size of multiple cities. It's like Mega City 1 from Judge Dredd, but it's underground, ruled by a computer who is terrified of commies, mostly commie mutant traitors.
Commie scum.
Commie scum. And the game came out in 1984. And for those of you who weren't alive, or at least reasonably sentient in 1984, commies were a genuine threat back then. I was, 1984, I was 18. And I genuinely didn't think I was going to live to see 25 because I thought I was going to die in a nuclear war. And that was just part of my everyday, it wasn't waking up from nightmares. That was just part of my everyday existence. It's, I'll push on, but I'll probably be dead in 5 years.
Yep.
At least it'll be fast. And the Terminator 2 is there's elements of that in there. The fear of nuclear war, the fear of the communist bloc. We weren't afraid of communists. We were afraid of the Russians, let's be honest. And then as Paranoia has gone on through subsequent editions, the commies have become a joke. Mm-hmm. The whole purpose of this is it's now funny that the computer is scared about commies, because why would commies be a threat? And we really wanted to put some of that element of threat back. So we didn't take the commies out. We just de-emphasized them and went, okay, now what the computer is afraid of now is terrorists. And we did not define terrorists. And a whole bunch of Americans immediately went, what, you mean ragheads? You mean Arabs? I don't see how that's different. We went, no, terrorists, like the Irish ones you were funding 10 years ago, you arseholes. And we didn't say it quite like that. But yeah, yes. And the cycle of the game, the meta cycle, the way it's constructed is that you start off as troubleshooters going out looking for terrorists. You blow up bits of Alpha Complex doing it because that's the way Paranoia works. And pretty soon, the computer thinks you're a terrorist. That doesn't work the same way with commies. And I was really pleased with that cycle. People didn't like it. People liked the commies. It was very much the nostalgia. People were fine with the comedy commies rather than the actual threatening commies. And I believe the new edition, the commies are back as the major threat. Haven't seen it yet. Wasn't consulted. Don't mind.
That's really interesting because I must have played Paranoia in the early 90s when I was a teenager. And so the Berlin Wall had fallen and it was a joke.
Yeah, same.
Already by then, because and I had lived through the 80s and had been scared of nuclear war, but I had always the idea that somehow, I don't know, it was just, were you the same, Andes?
Nope.
It was already a joke. No, it wasn't a
Nope.
joke to you.
By
It's
the
funny.
time by the time I played Paranoia, it may just be that I didn't pick up Paranoia until quite a bit later.
Yeah.
I didn't.
I picked up the GW version of Paranoia when it was first released, and that was
86,
very much.
I think. 80,
That
yeah,
sounds about
86,
right.
87.
Just
Yeah, I
before
bought the
Warhammer.
first box set I saw in, I think, 84 or possibly 85, as soon as it got over here,
Yeah.
and evangelized it. Just, told literally strangers in game shops, you need to buy this. It's brilliant.
So
It's a good game.
I always thought it was a joke, not because it was so late and that threat of nuclear war had gone. I always thought it was kind of taking the piss out of the McCarthyism era of just thinking that anyone who was different was a communist. So, you happen to be gay in Hollywood, you're probably a
It was the
communist.
labeling.
Like,
yeah.
that's what, it was the labeling that I
Mhm.
had. So I had always thought it was kind of poking fun at that kind of, paranoia of McCarthy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
And that it was an interesting, just as a brief
was
aside,
also
but
serious. Thanks,
yeah.
Brendan.
Yeah.
when you're talking about like the impact of mechanics on narrative, like it was an interesting one in terms of the impact of what you could buy in the core. And again, I don't know what edition it was I'd have been getting, but like obviously it listed
Probably
things you could
second.
buy in the equipment, and just the nature of the random things that were included in that influenced the farce of our experience as troubleshooters. I remember playing it with a mate of mine who never really played. He played a little bit of Shadowrun with us, but or Cyberpunk, but he didn't really roleplay a lot. But he got really into Paranoia, and then for like some reason, like dental floss, I think, was in the equipment chapter, and so he was like, "I'm going to buy like a fucking ton of dental floss." And we're like, "Oh, okay," and yet actually, it all the time we're like, "Oh, do we need something to tie something?" "Oh, I've got dental floss," and it became this running gag that he had this backpack full of dental floss. But all of that just came because that slightly random option was offered there. So,
I had a cello string in my bag the other day because, well, it's a long story as to why I had the cello string. But they come in packets in these little envelopes, and the cello string had been changed, and it had just been like wrapped up into the packet, and it had sort of like leapt out of the packet into my bag. And one of my teams like looked in my bag and was like, "Do you have a garrote in your work bag?" It's a cello string. So yeah.
Honest.
So Martin says my group just thought Paranoia was a race to get through as many clones as possible.
It can be.
Thermonuclear hand grenade.
Hand
Oh, I
grenade.
have fond memories of that. Yeah, good game.
Yeah. Again, Greg Kostikian, just absolute genius. Also, of course, responsible for the first Star Wars role-playing game, the West End Games, first edition of Star Wars, which we talked about with Kieran Gillan because it leans heavily into the archetypes. And just it gets Star Wars. If you want to see how to do the licensed version of a major media property as a role-playing game, look at how Star Wars, the role-playing game, just understands how Star Wars the movie works, or Star Wars the trilogy as it was, works, and just transfers that into a game experience. It's
and
quite
the impact
brilliant.
that it had on the overall setting as well, because so many species that we know now and today came from the roleplay game. They weren't created by Lucasfilm or whatever. So yeah, a very influential game.
And it really sustained the interest in the universe in those dark years before the prequels coming back. So
yeah.
And I'm not
then,
sure
of
they
course,
got brighter.
and then, of course, when they were looking for people to do the expanded universe novels, a bunch of them came out of roleplay. I mean, Mike Stackpole was an old role-playing game designer. He did a lot of stuff for Flying Buffalo and for, I think, did TSR stuff as well. Great designer. Oh, chunk of BattleTech stuff too. And they tapped him and he did Rogue Squadron and fundamental texts for the expanded universe. Yeah.
So Infinite Saxon asks, do you think a new edition should generally streamline or deepen existing mechanics? Yes.
Why not both? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's possible to do both. I think, as an example of a game that I was involved in, Nobilis Second Edition both streamlines and deepens the mechanics of the original Nobilis. I have never heard anyone say that the original Nobilis is a better edition than the second edition, partly because the original Nobilis is a quite small digest size stuff with second rights, actually out of copyright. I think Alphonse Mucha artwork. And the second edition that we did is a coffee table book with art from Brian Talbot and a whole bunch, Charles Vess and people like that in it.
Volume.
It was so much fun to work on. Speaking of proofreading, 5 proofreading passes we made on that book, and that literally we get them back from the printer, we open it up, and the first thing we spot is a typo.
It's every time.
It's a universal rule. But yeah, I think you can do both. And, you know, I mentioned GBI, which adds more mechanics, which was absolutely not. I think what a second edition can do usefully is, as your understanding of the setting matures through play, through reports of play, and through the supplements that you've brought out for first edition, you understand more of what the setting requires in terms of mechanics to model it and bring out its interesting facets. And so that's what you should be doing with a mechanical rebuild for the game.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on this one. And with a small addendum of, if you can hire the people who were involved before, even if it's just in a consultation front, so that you can sit down and say, what were all of your concerns first time around? And what can we do to address those and ensure that all the things that you've noticed are covered? Because if you're bringing in a second edition with a new team, you're almost effectively just bringing in a new game. And as much as we'd like that not to be the case, it kind of is. And I've been involved with both types of projects, and the more successful has always been the ones that involve everyone, if you possibly can. It makes an enormous difference. Take a look at what Chaosium is doing so successfully just now, where they're taking a lot of their original talent and bringing it back to the table that they were very comfortable upon, and they're nailing it.
Yes, and also people who have been involved with the system for so long. Mike Mason, who did the latest edition of Call of Cthulhu, has been, I mean, he's X Games Workshop.
He is.
But I think he is. But was doing a Cthulhu fanzine in the 90s, I think.
He was.
He lives and breathes that universe. His understanding of how it works is just organic. Perhaps not a good thing to be in the Cthulhu universe, but yeah, he just gets it. And they've got the new edition of Pendragon is just hitting backers now and early adopters and stuff. I cannot wait, because Pendragon is one of the great games as far as
certainly is. We were discussing that very game with its developer just a few months ago.
Oh,
and yeah, good times.
Yeah,
quite. It was. I think that was an episode about legacy games. I think about playing multiple generations rather than just playing individual PCs. I think it's back there somewhere. Yeah, it was really good. I enjoyed that chat.
So, Seagull asks, war games. I hate new editions where they change things so dramatically, often removing your beloved model from your army. Have you had such experience, and for how long did you lament? Yes, I have, and I still am lamenting. My Black Art Corsairs were unassailable, like just amazing, and then they weren't, thanks to whatever it was they changed them. I think they changed them from being ranked a ranked unit to being, what are they called when they
skirmishers?
Things. Thank you, Andy. I rely on Andy for all of my technical words for war games. And I just can't. My poor Dark Elf army, they're just doomed to death. So I'm still lamenting, and that has been a number of years.
Yeah.
No, go James.
I was just going to say, I don't play war games, particularly not miniatures based ones. But you know, similar memories of playing World of Warcraft almost exhaustively about 15 years ago, and then they nerfed not even everything, but a couple of things about the class. I was playing a hunter and a druid. The druids in particular got nerfed on a regular basis. But there was one thing, I was engaged in a 6-month quest to acquire a legendary weapon just to get the achievement point, because I'm that kind of player. And by the time I had finished the quest, they had changed the conditions that it wasn't enough to own it. You had to be able to equip it, but it was a hammer, and hunters can't equip hammers, or couldn't equip hammers. Okay. And they hadn't flagged this change, that you had to be able to wield it rather than just own it. And so I'd done 6 months' work to own a thing that I couldn't sell to anyone. I couldn't give to anyone else in my guild. It was entirely useless, and I couldn't get the achievement.
That's disappointing.
And I am still angry. I am still genuinely angry about that.
Yeah,
not a war game, but same principle.
The same principle. I think in general, it's common across games where you've got something that is your fave, and you've been playing, and the games designers have looked at it and realized that for whatever reason that they have, it's going to change, and it causes issues. In my case, it was a Gene Stealer Cult Army, what I did love, and then it didn't exist anymore at all. And that was a very sad time for me. However, I did sell it for an awful lot of money. so I wasn't that upset in the end, but I was at the time as they moved from one edition to the next. And particularly with war games, and particularly with the way that Games Workshop has had that cycle of games moving through, it has been a constant issue. I used to work with them a lot in the local shops here, and it was a constant complaint whenever a new edition came in, but also combined with all of the excitement of a new edition.
Yeah, to be fair, like I stopped playing that Dark Elf army because it got halfway through switching their bases and just, I don't know, lost interest in such a tedious job. Especially because my original bases were so beautiful and snowy. Anyway, I could go on about this all night.
Yeah. I mean, there's two reasons. There are reasons for changing something like that because they're balancing it. And often the reason people get upset is they've spotted a loophole in the rules that they can, this particular troop, if used in a particular way, is particularly powerful. Obviously, the designers want to balance that. They want to take that out, and people get upset when that happens. The other reason, and Games Workshop have done this in the past, is they want to make more money. They want to take out something that is not selling as well as it used to and replace it with
codes,
but the fresh new thing that's going to sell better.
Yeah.
And they're a business. That's their job. They have shareholders. They are responsible for the incomes of a great many pension schemes around the world. They're major investors in a number of cases. They've got to do that. But it's still, when you're at the hard end, when you're the player and you've forked out all this money, it does hurt.
Yeah, it does. Particularly when you know, because you happen to be working for the company, that they've removed certain things you like purely because they were only going to have so many codes of a particular force there. So they're going to have 10 codes, as in 10 blisters. That's it. Meaning that they just eradicate a chunk of an army purely because they've made a financial decision to only have 10. And they won't even leave it to mail order. And you're just left there going, So yes, I can get where you're coming from, Seagoat.
And I did like what they did with the X-Wing game when they did that second edition, where they went out of their way to make sure that they provided new rules for everything that existed. You had to buy it, but you could buy a conversion kit that got you everything you needed. I am still a little salty that they made Slave One scum and villainy only. A little salty about that, but other than that, they handled it very well. So.
Yeah, like if they hadn't, I think I might have died given the amount of X-Wing ships that Andy has.
Yeah.
Just expired on the spot.
Yeah, that's fair.
That's not unfair.
Well, yeah. That's us. We're pretty much at the end of our hour. We've actually got loads of questions we didn't get to, but we'll save them as always for another stream later on.
I didn't even talk about Dragon Warriors. I didn't mention.
We didn't even reach Dragon Warriors.
Oh, good God! Yes.
Just one last question then. Martin asked, "Have you ever created anything you wish you could go back to and change, but have yet to do so or can't?"
Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4.
Yeah.
Same.
Still wish we could have done, and as Hog said, could have done the second edition of Woofer Up that we were kind of making plans towards, but it became increasingly clear that our license with Games Workshop had a time limit on it. And they wanted to do their own thing. They were going to, at some point, take the license away. So we decided we would focus on getting Realms of Sorcery out finally, and then taking a polite bow and leaving.
That's kind of happened with second to third as well, because there was a full third edition in the background getting made before Games Workshop went, we're changing our entire business model. Now we're licensing this out. And everyone in Black Industries went, oh, well, we're done.
Yeah.
See ya. And Mike Mason obviously then moved off too, because he was running Black Industries at that point, then moved on to go and do Cthulhu.
Yeah.
Right, there we go. So there's mine.
Apparently, we've all got Warhammer-related trauma. There we go.
we know when you work in someone else's IP.
Got a black orc on your back.
Yeah. We know our audience as well.
So, thank you to everyone. Thanks to my fellow panelists this evening. Thanks, as always, to our amazing patrons who make this possible. And thanks to everyone who dropped in to comment and chat. Please do like, share, subscribe, follow, do all of those things that people are supposed to do. And join us next week when we're talking to artist, writer, designer, and director Jason Wilson about eco gaming. Until then, good night. And all that remains for me to say is caw-caw, caw-caw. See you again soon. Bye.
Bye.